December 7, 1941. 7:48 a.m. Pearl Harbor, Oahu, Hawaii. The morning sun climbs over the Pacific, casting gold across the water. Battleship Row rests in perfect stillness. 8 massive warships sit anchored in pairs, their gray hulls reflecting the calm harbor. Sailors move lazily across decks. Some prepare for Sunday breakfast. Others write letters home. The air smells of salt and diesel fuel. A few men glance skyward at the distant hum of aircraft engines. They assume it's a drill. American planes from the mainland, perhaps. No alarm sounds. No guns turn. Then the first bomb falls. USS Arizona shudders as metal tears through her deck. Fire blooms orange and black. The harbor erupts. Men scramble. Sirens scream too late. In 90 minutes, the world will change forever. But the attack itself is not the mystery. The question is why? Why did Japan, a nation that knew it could not win a prolonged war with America, choose to strike first? The answer lies not in the smoke over Pearl Harbor, but in the years of desperation, miscalculation, and silent strangulation that came before. The empire's hunger, 1931 to 1937, Japan in the 1930s, was a nation trapped by geography. 4 volcanic islands, 80 million people, almost no oil, no rubber, no iron ore in quantities that mattered. Every gallon of fuel, every steel plate, every ounce of rubber for tires came from abroad. The empire's military ran on imported blood. Without resources, Japan could not sustain its army. Without its army, it could not protect itself from the colonial powers circling Asia. The logic seemed inescapable: expand or suffocate. The expansion began in Manchuria, September 18, 1931. Japanese officers of the Kwantung Army staged an explosion along the South Manchuria Railway near Mukden. They blamed Chinese dissidents. Within hours, Japanese troops poured across the border. The Mukden incident, as it became known, was a fabrication. But it worked. By February 1932, Japan controlled Manchuria, renaming it Manchukuo and installing a puppet emperor. The League of Nations condemned the invasion. Japan withdrew from the League. The message was clear. International law would not stop Japan's hunger. Manchuria offered coal, iron, and farmland. But it was not enough. Japan's military establishment, particularly the army, demanded more. They spoke of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a vision of Japanese-led Asian unity free from Western colonialism. In reality, it meant Japanese dominance. Resources would flow to Tokyo. The rhetoric of liberation masked the machinery of extraction. China became the next target. July 7, 1937. Marco Polo Bridge, southwest of Beijing. A skirmish between Japanese and Chinese troops escalated into full-scale war. Japanese forces swept through northern China. Shanghai fell after brutal urban combat. Nanjing followed in December. What happened in Nanjing over 6 weeks remains one of the war's darkest chapters. Mass executions, systematic rape, civilian slaughter. Estimates range from 200,000 to 300,000 dead. The atrocity shocked the world. Western newspapers published photographs. Diplomats filed protests. But words did not stop armies. Japan's war machine now controlled vast territory: Manchuria, northern China, coastal cities, ports, railways, mines. Yet the deeper Japan advanced, the more resources it consumed. Fuel for tanks, ammunition for artillery, supplies for occupation forces. The empire devoured what it conquered, always needing more. Japanese planners eyed Southeast Asia. The Dutch East Indies held oil. Malaya had rubber and tin. Indochina offered rice and strategic position. But these territories belonged to European colonial powers: Britain, France, the Netherlands, and behind them all stood the United States. America watched Japan's expansion with growing alarm. President Franklin Roosevelt, though focused on domestic recovery from the Depression, could not ignore Japanese aggression. The rape of Nanjing particularly outraged American public opinion. Missionaries in China sent horrifying reports. Newsreels showed burning cities. Roosevelt began applying pressure. Not military force. Not yet. Economic pressure. In 1938, the U.S. imposed a moral embargo on aircraft exports to Japan. In 1939, it terminated the 1911 commercial treaty with Japan, effective January 1940. The message was deliberate. Trade was conditional. Aggression had consequences. Japan faced a choice: withdraw from China and restore relations with America, or continue the war and risk American retaliation. The military leadership refused withdrawal. Years of fighting, hundreds of thousands of Japanese casualties, billions spent. To retreat would mean admitting failure, dishonoring the dead, undermining the entire imperial project. The army could not accept it. The political structure could not force it. Japan's government operated through consensus, with the military holding effective veto power over policy. No prime minister could overrule the generals. The empire was locked into a course it could not abandon. By 1940, the situation grew desperate. Germany had conquered France. The Netherlands fell. Britain fought for survival. The colonial powers in Asia were suddenly vulnerable, their motherlands occupied or besieged, their Asian colonies defended by skeleton forces. Japan saw opportunity. In September 1940, Japanese troops moved into northern French Indochina. The Vichy French government, collaborating with Germany, could not resist. Japan now sat astride the main supply route to China. The Burma Road, running through British Burma, remained the only lifeline for Chinese resistance. Cutting it became Japan's next objective. But every move south brought Japan closer to collision with America. Roosevelt responded to the Indochina occupation by expanding export controls. Scrap metal, aviation fuel, high-grade iron, the items Japan needed most. The economic vice tightened. Japanese reserves dwindled. Military planners calculated consumption rates. At current usage, oil stocks would last perhaps 2 years. Less if war expanded. The empire faced a countdown. Each day brought Japan closer to the moment when its ships could not sail, its planes could not fly, its trucks could not move. The question was no longer if Japan would act, but when, and against whom. The tightening noose. 1938-1941. The noose tightened through 1941. Not with rope, but with spreadsheets and shipping manifests. American economic warfare proved devastatingly effective. Japan imported 80% of its oil from the United States and the Dutch East Indies. By summer 1941, that flow had slowed to a trickle. Japanese tankers sat empty at dock. Refineries operated below capacity. Military stockpiles, carefully hoarded, represented finite months of operation. The Imperial Navy calculated it had reserves for perhaps 18 months of combat operations. After that, the fleet would become an expensive collection of immobile steel. July 1941 marked the point of no return. Japanese forces occupied southern French Indochina, seizing bases near Saigon. The move brought Japanese aircraft within striking range of Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. Roosevelt responded immediately. On July 26, he issued an executive order freezing all Japanese assets in the United States. Britain and the Dutch government in exile followed. The freeze effectively halted all trade. No oil, no scrap metal, no machinery. Japan's economy faced strangulation. The empire could not function without American resources, yet could not obtain them without abandoning its entire strategic position in Asia. Japanese leaders understood the mathematics of their situation. Prime Minister Prince Fumimaro Konoe, a moderate by the standards of Tokyo's militarized government, sought compromise. He proposed a summit meeting with Roosevelt, personal diplomacy between leaders. Perhaps they could find middle ground. Roosevelt, advised by Secretary of State Cordell Hull, declined. The president doubted Konoe's ability to control the military. Previous Japanese promises had proven worthless. Words without enforcement meant nothing. Roosevelt demanded concrete actions first. Withdrawal from Indochina. Withdrawal from China. Only then would negotiations proceed. The demand was impossible. Konoe could not deliver Chinese withdrawal even if he wanted to. The army would rather overthrow the government than retreat. Japanese military culture, steeped in Bushido traditions and modern nationalism, viewed withdrawal as unthinkable dishonor. Officers had spent years telling soldiers their sacrifices served the empire's survival. How could they now say those deaths were meaningless? That the war had been a mistake? The army would sooner risk annihilation than admit failure. And the army held the power. Ministers who displeased the military were simply removed, sometimes violently. Political assassination had become routine in 1930s Japan. Negotiations continued through autumn 1941, but both sides negotiated in bad faith. Japanese diplomats in Washington presented proposals knowing the military would never implement them. American officials demanded terms knowing Japan could never accept them. The talks became theater. Each side performed for domestic audiences and international observers, demonstrating reasonableness while preparing for war. Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura, a retired admiral, genuinely sought peace. He met repeatedly with Hull searching for compromise, but Tokyo's instructions left him no room to maneuver. Every proposal contained conditions America rejected. Every American counter-proposal demanded what Japan refused to surrender. October 1941 brought crisis. Konoe's government fell. The army demanded a more compliant prime minister. General Hideki Tojo took power on October 18th. Tojo was not a reckless warmonger, as Allied propaganda later portrayed. He was a disciplined administrator, methodical and loyal to the emperor. But he was also a creature of the military establishment, committed to the China War and convinced of Japan's righteous cause. His appointment signaled that moderates had lost. The military now controlled policy completely. Tojo set a deadline. Early December. If diplomacy produced no breakthrough, Japan would go to war. The decision was not quite final. Emperor Hirohito, nominally supreme, could theoretically overrule his ministers. But the emperor rarely exercised direct authority. His role was symbolic, providing divine legitimacy to decisions made by others. For Hirohito to personally stop the war would require breaking centuries of imperial precedent. It would also require defying the military that claimed to serve him. The emperor worried. He questioned. He asked for continued diplomatic efforts, but he did not forbid war. November 26, 1941. Secretary Hull delivered what became known as the Hull Note. 10 points. America's final offer. Japan must withdraw all military forces from China and Indochina. Recognize the nationalist government in China. Withdraw from the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy. In exchange, America would resume trade and unfreeze Japanese assets. To American officials, the terms seemed reasonable. Japan would gain economic relief by abandoning its expensive, brutal war. To Japanese leaders, the Hull Note was an ultimatum demanding total capitulation. Everything Japan had fought for since 1931. Every sacrifice, every victory, every drop of blood, all rendered meaningless, accept subjugation or face war. The note reached Tokyo on November 27th after translation. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo read it with sinking realization. No compromise was possible. The Hull Note left no middle ground. Japan must either surrender its position as a great power or fight. The government held a final imperial conference on December 1, 1941. Military leaders presented their plans. Navy Chief of Staff Admiral Osami Nagano explained that Japan's oil would run out within 2 years without war. With war, there was a chance. Perhaps a limited conflict. Force America to negotiate. Secure the Dutch East Indies oil fields. Create a defensive perimeter. Make the cost of defeating Japan so high that Roosevelt would accept a settlement. It was a gamble. Everyone knew it. But the alternative seemed worse. Slow starvation. Economic collapse. Imperial humiliation without a fight. Emperor Hirohito approved the decision for war. Not enthusiastically, not happily, but he approved. The date was set. December 8th, Tokyo time. December 7th across the international dateline in Hawaii. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet, finalized plans for the Pearl Harbor strike. Yamamoto opposed war with America. He had studied at Harvard, served as naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industrial power. He predicted that Japan might win victories for 6 months, perhaps a year. After that, America's factories would bury Japan in ships, planes, and tanks. But Yamamoto was a sailor. Orders were orders. If Japan must fight, he would deliver the best possible opening blow. Cripple the American Pacific Fleet. Buy time for Southern operations. Hope that shock and early victories would make America reconsider the cost of war. The trap had closed completely. America demanded Japan's surrender without war. Japan chose war rather than surrender. Neither side understood the other. Americans believed economic pressure would force Japanese compliance. Japanese believed a sharp blow would force American compromise. Both were wrong. The miscalculation would cost millions of lives. And it began with the simple, terrible logic of resource scarcity meeting imperial pride. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor not because it wanted war with America, but because it saw no other choice. The truth no one told was that the attack was an act of desperation, not aggression. A drowning man's last gasp for air. It would fail. But in December 1941, surrounded by shrinking options and dwindling fuel, Japan's leaders could see no alternative but to strike. Multiple perspectives on the road to Pearl Harbor. Angle 1. The resource calculus. Oil, steel, and survival numbers told the story more clearly than speeches. Japan's economy consumed approximately 12,000 tons of oil daily in peacetime. War operations tripled that figure. By July 1941, Japan held roughly 43 million barrels in reserve. At wartime consumption rates, those reserves would last 18 to 24 months. After that, the Imperial Navy would become the world's most expensive collection of anchored metal. Army trucks would sit motionless. Aircraft would remain grounded. The entire military structure would collapse not from defeat, but from fuel starvation. Japanese planners obsessed over these calculations. Lieutenant Colonel Takushiro Hattori, working in the Army General Staff, spent months analyzing resource flows. His reports painted a grim picture. Without American imports, Japan's steel production would drop by 75% within 6 months. Machine tool manufacturing would cease almost entirely. The war in China, already consuming vast quantities of ammunition and fuel, would become unsustainable. Withdrawal would follow not from military defeat, but from logistical impossibility. The Dutch East Indies represented salvation. Sumatra and Borneo held oil fields producing roughly 65 million barrels annually, enough to sustain Japan's military and economy indefinitely. But seizing those fields meant war with the Netherlands, which meant war with Britain, which almost certainly meant war with America. The Americans had made their position clear through diplomatic channels. An attack on British or Dutch possessions in Asia would trigger American intervention. Japan could not have the oil without fighting everyone. Some officers proposed a more limited strategy. Strike south but avoid American territory. Leave the Philippines alone. Perhaps Roosevelt would accept a fait accompli rather than enter war over European colonial possessions. Admiral Yamamoto crushed this fantasy. American bases in the Philippines sat astride Japan's supply lines to the Dutch East Indies. American submarines would strangle Japanese tankers. American bombers would strike invasion convoys. Leaving the Philippines untouched while attacking southward was strategically impossible. If Japan went south, it must also go east. The geometry of the Pacific allowed no half measures. The resource calculus offered no good options. Accept American terms and abandon China, losing everything gained in 10 years of war. Continue the status quo and watch fuel reserves drain to zero. Or strike now while reserves remained, gambling on a short victorious war before American industry mobilized. Japanese leaders chose the gamble. They knew the odds were poor, but certainty of slow defeat seemed worse than uncertain chance of limited victory. Angle 2. The diplomatic failure. The Hull Note and the point of no return diplomacy died by miscommunication and mistrust. Both sides negotiated, but neither truly sought compromise. American officials viewed Japanese proposals as transparent stalling tactics. Japanese diplomats viewed American demands as deliberate humiliation. The gap between positions was not merely wide, it was unbridgeable. Each side operated from fundamentally incompatible assumptions about what constituted reasonable settlement. Secretary of State Cordell Hull embodied American frustration. A Tennessee Democrat, Hull had spent decades in public service. He believed in international law, treaty obligations, and the power of economic leverage. To Hull, Japan's conquest of China represented naked aggression that violated every principle of civilized international relations. The solution seemed obvious. Japan should withdraw, restore Chinese sovereignty, and rejoin the community of law-abiding nations. America would then resume normal trade. Simple cause and effect. But Hull fundamentally misunderstood Japanese politics. He imagined Tokyo operated like Washington, with civilian leaders controlling military policy. In reality, Japan's government functioned through fragile consensus between competing factions. The military held veto power. Any prime minister who seriously proposed Chinese withdrawal would face immediate removal, possibly assassination. Japanese politics had devolved into a system where moderates could slow decisions but not stop them. The hardliners always won eventually because they were willing to use violence against domestic opponents. The Hull note of November 26 proved particularly catastrophic. Hull intended it as a basis for further discussion, a strong opening position from which both sides could negotiate toward middle ground. But the note's language was absolute. Complete withdrawal. No qualifications, no face-saving measures, no gradual process, just surrender of everything Japan had fought for, with vague promises of restored trade in return. Japanese leaders read the note not as negotiating position but as ultimatum. America demanded capitulation without compromise. What Hull failed to grasp was that the note made war inevitable. Japanese moderates had argued for continued diplomacy by claiming America might eventually accept partial withdrawal, a staged process, perhaps keeping Manchuria while leaving China proper. The Hull note destroyed those arguments. Now the hardliners could say, truthfully, that America would accept nothing less than total surrender. Negotiation was pointless. Japan must either fight or accept vassal status. Ambassador Nomura, who had worked genuinely for peace, felt personally betrayed. He had assured Tokyo that Hull was negotiating in good faith. That common ground existed. The Hull note made him look naive or dishonest. His position in Tokyo became untenable. The final diplomatic meetings in late November and early December were theater. Both sides went through motions, preparing their populations for war while pretending to seek peace. Nomura and Special Envoy Saburo Kurusu met with Hull on December 7th. Even as Japanese planes approached Hawaii, they carried a message breaking off negotiations. Due to translation delays and deliberate stalling, they delivered it after the attack had begun. The timing made Japan look treacherous. It was actually incompetence, but the result was the same. Diplomacy failed not because war was inevitable, but because neither side could accept what the other demanded, and neither understood how the other thought. Angle 3. The military mindset. Honor, strategy, and Yamamoto's doubts. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto planned the Pearl Harbor attack with skill and dread. Yamamoto was among Japan's most brilliant naval strategists. He had commanded carriers, studied aviation, and recognized air power's growing dominance. He was also one of the few Japanese leaders who truly understood America. His time at Harvard and in Washington had taught him that America's industrial capacity was essentially limitless. Japan might win battles, but it could not win a prolonged war against a nation that produced more steel in a year than Japan produced in a decade. Yamamoto had opposed war with America openly. In military councils, he stated bluntly that Japan could not win. He predicted that the Navy might run wild for 6 months or a year, achieving victories while American industry slept. Then the factories would awaken. New carriers, new battleships, new aircraft by the thousands. Japan would be buried under American production. His calculations showed that America could replace any losses Japan inflicted within months. Japan could not replace anything. Each ship sunk, each plane lost, diminished a finite force that would not be replenished. But Yamamoto was also a warrior bound by duty. When the government decided for war, his personal opinions became irrelevant. His job was to give Japan the best possible chance. If war was inevitable, then Japan needed a devastating opening blow. cripple the American Pacific Fleet, destroy its battleships, force America to negotiate from weakness before its industrial machine produced an unstoppable force. The plan was brilliant in conception. 6 aircraft carriers, over 400 planes, strike at dawn on a Sunday when American forces were least alert. Sink the battleships. Destroy aircraft on the ground. Buy time for Southern operations to secure oil fields. The plan also revealed the military mindset that made war inevitable. Japanese officers believed that fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage. That superior training and willingness to die would counter American numerical superiority. That one Japanese soldier was worth 10 Americans because Japanese warriors embraced death without fear. This belief was not entirely baseless. Japanese forces were indeed well-trained, disciplined, and committed. But the belief became dangerous when it led to strategic miscalculation. Wars were not won by courage alone. They were won by factories, fuel, and logistics. And in those categories, America was untouchable. Junior officers were even more deluded. Many believed the attack on Pearl Harbor would so shock America that Roosevelt would immediately negotiate peace. That American civilians, soft and materialistic, would refuse to fight a long war for distant territories. That democracy's weakness was its inability to sustain sacrifice. These assumptions were completely wrong, rooted in contempt for democratic culture and ignorance of American history. But they were widely held, and they made war seem winnable. The military mindset also required ignoring inconvenient facts. Intelligence reports showed that American aircraft carriers were frequently absent from Pearl Harbor. This meant that even a successful attack might miss the most valuable targets. Yamamoto knew this. He proceeded anyway because the political decision for war had been made. His duty was execution, not reconsideration. This separation between political decision and military implementation was itself a fatal flaw. Japan's system allowed the military to force political decisions toward war, then required the military to implement those decisions regardless of strategic sense. Once the machine began moving, no one could stop it. Honor, duty, and organizational momentum combined into a force more powerful than reason. Yamamoto planned Pearl Harbor brilliantly, but he never believed it would lead to victory, only to a less catastrophic defeat. Angle 4. The American blindness, intelligence failures, and underestimation. American intelligence knew war was coming. They simply did not know where or when. Throughout November 1941, signals intelligence intercepted and decoded Japanese diplomatic messages. The system, codenamed Magic, had cracked Japan's diplomatic cipher. American cryptanalysts read Tokyo's instructions to its embassies in real time. The messages showed clear preparation for war. References to deadlines, orders to destroy code machines, instructions for final negotiations. Washington knew Japan would strike somewhere in early December. But knowing war was imminent, and knowing the target were different problems entirely. American military planners assumed Japan would strike south. The Philippines seemed likely. Perhaps British Malaya or Singapore. Maybe the Dutch East Indies directly. These targets made strategic sense. They held the resources Japan needed. Pearl Harbor was too distant, too difficult, too risky. Conventional wisdom said Japan would not waste strength on a peripheral target when vital objectives lay elsewhere. This assumption was not stupidity. It was logical analysis based on observed patterns. Japan had always moved incrementally. Manchuria, then coastal China, then northern Indochina, then southern Indochina. Each step brought resources or strategic position. Each step avoided direct confrontation with America. Why would Japan suddenly abandon this methodical approach for a dramatic gamble across the Pacific? American planners projected their own logic onto Japanese decision-making. They assumed rationality would prevent what they considered irrational. The failure went deeper than strategic assessment. It involved racial prejudice and cultural contempt. Many American military officers believed Japanese forces were inherently inferior, that Japanese pilots could not fly well because of poor eyesight, that Japanese engineers copied Western designs without understanding them, that Japanese industry could not produce modern weapons in quantity. These beliefs were objectively false. Japanese Zero fighters were among the world's best aircraft in 1941. Japanese torpedoes were technologically superior to American models. Japanese carrier tactics were more advanced than American doctrine. But racism made Americans blind to evidence contradicting their prejudices. Admiral Husband Kimmel commanded the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. He received warnings from Washington about potential Japanese action. But the warnings were vague. Prepare for possible hostile action. Be alert. Take defensive measures. Nothing specific about Hawaii. Nothing suggesting imminent attack. Kimmel believed his greater threat was sabotage from Hawaii's large Japanese-American population. He ordered aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip to prevent sabotage. This made them perfect targets for air attack. The defensive measure designed to prevent one threat created vulnerability to another. Lieutenant General Walter Short, commanding Army forces in Hawaii, made similar calculations. He worried about sabotage, about fifth columnists, about local Japanese residents providing intelligence to Tokyo. He did not worry about carrier-based air attack because he believed, like most officers, that Japan lacked the capability. Short placed his radar stations on limited operating schedules to save equipment. Early morning of December 7th, operators detected incoming aircraft at 132 miles distance. They reported the contact. The duty officer dismissed it. Probably American B-17s flying in from California. Expected arrival that morning. No cause for alarm. The intelligence was there. The pieces existed. But no one assembled them into the correct picture. This was not unique failure. Intelligence analysis always involves sorting signal from noise, relevant from irrelevant. Pearl Harbor's mistake was assuming that what seemed irrational to Americans would also seem irrational to Japanese planners. That Japanese strategy would mirror American strategic logic. The blindness came from mirror imaging, from assuming the enemy thinks like you. They did not, and the failure to grasp that fundamental difference cost 2,403 American lives on a Sunday morning. Angle 5. The gambler's logic. Japan's calculated risk. Japan's decision for war was not madness. It was calculated desperation. Leaders in Tokyo understood they were gambling. They assessed odds carefully. And they chose to bet everything because the alternatives seemed worse. This was gambler's logic. The belief that a small chance of winning is better than certainty of slow defeat. That action, even risky action, is better than passive acceptance of doom. The strategic concept was limited war. Japan would strike hard and fast across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Destroy American battleships at Pearl Harbor. Cripple American air power in the Philippines. Seize Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines within 6 months. Establish a defensive perimeter from Burma to the Marshall Islands. Fortify it with aircraft and naval forces. Then dare America to pay the blood price of crossing thousands of miles of ocean to assault prepared positions. Each island would cost thousands of American lives. After a year of casualties with no end in sight, American public opinion would turn against the war. Roosevelt would negotiate. Japan would keep its conquests. The empire would survive. This strategy required several assumptions. First, that American morale was weak. That democratic populations would not sustain heavy casualties for distant territories. Second, that American racism would make them underestimate Japanese fighting ability, leading to early defeats that would discourage further effort. Third, that Germany would defeat Britain and the Soviet Union, leaving America isolated and unwilling to fight alone. Fourth, that Japan's defensive perimeter could actually hold against determined assault. Every assumption was flawed. Japanese planners knew the strategy was risky. Navy Chief of Staff Nagano told the emperor that Japan had perhaps a 30% chance of victory, maybe less, but he argued that doing nothing guaranteed defeat. Oil would run out. The military would collapse. China would push back Japanese forces. The empire would disintegrate without firing a shot at America. At least war offered a chance, however small. The emperor asked if they were certain there was no diplomatic solution. Nagano replied that America's demands required total surrender. War or submission were the only options. This logic ignored a critical reality. America's response to Pearl Harbor would not be discouragement. It would be rage. Japanese planners assumed Americans thought like Japanese. That surprise attack would generate respect for Japanese boldness and calculation about costs. They failed to grasp that Americans would view surprise attack during peace negotiations as treachery deserving unlimited retaliation. The cultural gap was total. Japanese military culture admired the surprise attack as clever strategy. American culture saw it as unforgivable dishonor requiring absolute vengeance. The gamble also assumed Germany would win in Europe. If Britain fell, if the Soviet Union collapsed, then America might indeed negotiate peace in the Pacific rather than fight alone. But Germany's attack on the Soviet Union in June 1941 was already stalling by December. Winter had come. The Wehrmacht was freezing outside Moscow. The easy victories were over. Germany would not defeat the Soviets, which meant Britain would survive, which meant America would have powerful allies. Japan bet on German victory and lost that bet before Pearl Harbor even happened. The final miscalculation involved American character. Japanese leaders believed democracies were weak, that American society was too individualistic and pleasure-seeking to sustain sacrifice. They missed that America's strength came precisely from its democratic culture. American industry was efficient because it rewarded innovation. American soldiers were effective because they thought independently. American society could absorb enormous casualties because citizens understood why they fought. Japan gambled that America was weak. They discovered America was the strongest opponent they could possibly have chosen. The gamble failed not because the plan was poorly executed, but because the fundamental assumptions were entirely wrong. Angle 6. The human cost. Soldiers and civilians on both sides behind strategic calculations were human beings who would pay the price. Japanese pilots who flew to Pearl Harbor were young men, most in their 20s. They had trained for years. They believed they served their emperor and protected their nation. Many left letters for families expecting to die in the attack. Kamikaze culture did not yet exist, but the willingness to die for Japan was already embedded in military training. These pilots were not mindless fanatics. They were professionals doing their duty. Most would survive Pearl Harbor. Many would die in later battles. Some would question whether the war was worth its cost. But in December 1941, they believed they fought to save Japan from strangulation. American sailors at Pearl Harbor were equally young. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, recent high school graduates seeking adventure and steady pay. Most had never imagined combat. The Navy was supposed to be safer than the Army. Ships had thick armor. The Pacific Fleet in Hawaii seemed far from any fighting. Sunday morning, December 7th, many were sleeping in. Others ate breakfast. Some were ashore on liberty. Then bombs fell. Men trapped below decks in capsizing ships drowned in darkness. Others burned in oil fires that spread across the water. Some survived by swimming through flames. The attack lasted less than 2 hours. For those who lived through it, the experience would define the rest of their lives. USS Arizona suffered the worst. A bomb struck her forward magazine at 8:06 a.m. The explosion tore the ship apart. Over 1,000 men died instantly or trapped inside the sinking hull. Among them was Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, killed on the bridge. Band members who had been preparing for morning colors. Engine room crew who never saw sky. The ship settled on the harbor bottom with most of her crew still inside. They remained there. Arizona is a tomb and a memorial. Oil still leaks from her ruptured fuel tanks, rising as dark droplets called black tears. Japanese losses were minimal during the attack. 29 aircraft shot down, 5 midget submarines destroyed, fewer than 100 men killed. But the raid's success guaranteed a larger human cost later. Every Japanese pilot who survived Pearl Harbor would face American revenge across the Pacific. The war they helped start would kill over 3 million Japanese. Civilians would die in firebomb raids. Cities would burn. Hiroshima and Nagasaki would vanish in atomic fire. The young men who achieved brilliant tactical victory at Pearl Harbor had unknowingly signed their nation's death warrant. Hawaiian civilians, particularly Japanese Americans, faced immediate suspicion. Hawaii's population was nearly 40% Japanese ancestry. Most were American citizens. Many had never been to Japan. After the attack, suspicion fell on the entire community. Were some helping Japan? Providing intelligence? Sabotaging defenses? The fears were mostly baseless. But they shaped policy. Eventually, over 100,000 Japanese Americans on the mainland West Coast would be forced into internment camps. Hawaii's Japanese population was too large to intern without destroying the island economy. But the suspicion remained. Loyalty was questioned. Families were divided. The cost of Japan's attack included the destruction of innocent lives on both sides. Chinese civilians paid perhaps the highest price. Japan's war in China continued through December 1941 and beyond. Millions died, not just soldiers but civilians caught in occupation zones, subjected to forced labor, starvation, disease, and systematic brutality. The resources Japan hoped to secure by attacking Pearl Harbor were meant to continue the China War. Every bullet fired at Pearl Harbor represented food taken from Chinese mouths. Every bomb dropped on Hawaii was manufactured from iron ore mined by Chinese slave labor. The human cost of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond Hawaii. Touching millions who never heard the bombs fall but suffered under the empire those bombs were meant to sustain. The truth about Pearl Harbor includes these human stories, not just battleships and strategy, but people. Young men who believed they served honorable causes, civilians who suffered for decisions they did not make, families torn apart by war between nations. The attack was strategic calculation, but the cost was measured in human grief that transcended nationality and lasted generations. December 7, 1941, 6 a.m., 230 miles north of Oahu. 6 aircraft carriers cut through dark Pacific swells. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku. The most powerful naval strike force ever assembled. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded from Akagi's bridge. He had maintained radio silence for 12 days, crossing the Pacific undetected via a northern route that avoided shipping lanes. Weather had been brutal. Crews worked through storms and freezing spray, but they had arrived undetected. Now, in pre-dawn darkness, flight decks swarmed with activity. Deck crews pushed aircraft into launch positions. Mechanics performed final checks. Armament crews loaded torpedoes and bombs. The torpedoes were specially modified. Pearl Harbor averaged 40 feet deep in the anchorage area. Standard torpedoes dove deeper after launch, hitting bottom uselessly. Japanese engineers had designed shallow-running torpedoes with wooden fins. They would dive only 12 feet before leveling off. Bomb crews loaded armor-piercing shells modified into bombs, 16-inch naval shells fitted with fins, designed to punch through battleship deck armor. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led the first wave. A veteran pilot, calm and precise. He climbed into his Nakajima B-5N bomber at 6:15 a.m. Around him, 183 aircraft prepared for launch. 49 high-level bombers, 40 torpedo bombers, 51 dive bombers, 43 Zero fighters. The carriers turned into the wind. Launch officers waved green signal lamps. Engines roared. One by one, aircraft thundered down wooden decks and clawed into gray sky. By 6:20 a.m., the first wave was airborne, forming into attack groups. Fuchida navigated by dead reckoning and radio signals. The Honolulu commercial station played music through the night. Its signal provided a beacon straight to Oahu. At 7:40 a.m., the island came into view. Mountains materialized from morning haze. Fuchida scanned the harbor with binoculars. Battleship Row lay exactly where intelligence promised. 8 battleships in pairs along the southeast shore of Ford Island. Nevada moored alone. Arizona and Vestal together. Tennessee and West Virginia. Maryland and Oklahoma. California at the southern end. Pennsylvania sat in dry dock. The carriers were absent. Enterprise and Lexington were at sea. Saratoga was on the west coast. But the battleships were the primary targets. Fuchida fired a signal flare. Black smoke. The attack signal, 7:48 a.m. The first bombs fell. Not on ships, but on Wheeler Field and Ford Island Naval Air Station. Dive bombers screamed down. releasing ordnance on parked aircraft. Planes exploded. Fuel tanks erupted. American aircraft, parked wing to wing for easy guarding, became a continuous line of fire. Within minutes, most of Hawaii's air defense capability was burning wreckage. The torpedo bombers came in low, skimming 50 feet above water. Pilots flew between moored ships, weaving through anti-aircraft fire that was only beginning to respond. Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata led the torpedo squadron. His first wave targeted Battleship Row's outboard ships. Oklahoma took 3 torpedoes in rapid succession on her port side. The massive vessel shuddered. Water poured into ruptured compartments. She began listing immediately. Watertight doors slammed shut, trapping men below. Within 12 minutes, Oklahoma rolled completely over. Her hull broke the surface, bottom up. Over 400 men remained trapped inside. West Virginia took 7 torpedoes. Counter-flooding by quick-thinking damage control prevented her from capsizing like Oklahoma, but the damage was catastrophic. Her captain, Mervyn Bennion, stood on the bridge directing damage control when shrapnel from an exploding bomb tore through his abdomen. He refused evacuation. He continued giving orders until blood loss forced him to lie down. He died on his bridge, still commanding his ship. West Virginia settled upright on the harbor bottom, her decks awash. California took 2 torpedoes. She was buttoned up for inspection, watertight doors open, ventilation running. Water flooded freely between compartments. She settled slowly, taking 3 days to finally rest on the bottom. Nevada, moored alone at the northern end of Battleship Row, managed to get underway. Her crew had seen the attack coming and scrambled to battle stations faster than other ships. As bombs fell around her, Nevada cast off lines and began moving toward the harbor entrance. Sailors on other ships cheered. One battleship was fighting back. 05 a.m. Arizona's world ended. A high-level bomber from Fuchida's group released an armor-piercing bomb from 10,000 feet. The modified 16-inch shell fell for 18 seconds. It struck Arizona's deck near Turret 2, forward of the bridge. The bomb punched through steel plate, through multiple decks, into the forward magazine. Over 1,000 tons of gunpowder detonated simultaneously. The explosion lifted Arizona's bow out of the water. A fireball mushroomed 500 feet into the air. The blast killed 1,177 men instantly. Admiral Kidd, Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg, most of the crew. The ship broke apart and sank in 9 minutes. Sailors on nearby ships felt the shockwave. Some were thrown off their feet. Burning debris rained across the harbor. Oil spread from Arizona's ruptured tanks, carrying fire across the water. Tennessee, moored inboard of West Virginia, was trapped. West Virginia's sinking hull pinned Tennessee against Ford Island. Tennessee took 2 bomb hits but remained afloat. Her crew could only watch as ships around them burned. Maryland, protected by Oklahoma's capsized hull, suffered relatively minor damage. 3 bomb hits, hull damage, but she remained functional. Pennsylvania, in dry dock, took 1 bomb hit and survived with minimal casualties. 25 a.m. American resistance strengthened. Sailors manned any weapon they could reach. 50 caliber machine guns, anti-aircraft batteries, small arms. Some guns fired without authorization. Officers were dead or trapped below. Enlisted men took initiative. They shot at aircraft with rifles and pistols, mostly ineffective, but psychologically crucial. Doing something, anything, was better than helplessness. Ensign Joe Tausig commanded Nevada's anti-aircraft battery. His leg was severed below the knee by shrapnel. He refused evacuation. He tied a tourniquet himself and continued directing fire from a chair. His gun crews shot down several attacking aircraft. Nevada limped toward the harbor entrance, burning but moving. Japanese pilots saw the movement. A battleship escaping would complicate follow-up operations. Dive bombers swarmed Nevada. Bomb after bomb struck her decks. Fires spread. The harbor signal tower ordered Nevada to beach herself rather than sink in the channel and block the entrance. Nevada's captain ran her aground near Hospital Point. She would survive. But she was finished for this battle. 40 a.m. The first wave completed its attack. Fuchida circled overhead, assessing damage. 5 battleships were sinking or sunk. 3 were damaged. Hundreds of aircraft destroyed. Oil fires spread across the water. Smoke rose thousands of feet. The destruction exceeded expectations. But the carriers were absent. The fuel storage tanks on the island remained untouched. Repair facilities were intact. Fuchida radioed Nagumo. Attack successful. Recommend third wave to destroy port facilities and fuel storage. The second wave arrived. 167 aircraft led by Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki. Their mission was different. Finish damaged ships. Attack airfields again. Destroy anything the first wave missed. They faced heavier anti-aircraft fire. American gunners had their weapons manned now. Some had ammunition. They poured fire into the sky. Several Japanese aircraft fell. But the second wave pressed attacks. More bombs fell on ships, airfields, and buildings. Hickam Field's hangars collapsed. Barracks at Wheeler Field burned. Kaneohe Naval Air Station lost most of its flying boats. The attack ended at 9:45 a.m. Japanese aircraft withdrew, flying north to their carriers. Behind them, Pearl Harbor burned. Black smoke towered into tropical sky. Ships listed or lay capsized. Bodies floated in oily water. The attack had lasted less than 2 hours, but it had changed everything. The cost in American lives: 2,403 dead, 178 wounded. In ships, 4 battleships sunk, 4 damaged, 3 cruisers damaged, 3 destroyers damaged, nearly 200 aircraft destroyed. The Pacific Fleet was crippled. Japan had achieved tactical surprise so complete that American forces barely fired back during the first 30 minutes. The gamble had worked. The opening blow had landed perfectly. December 7, 1941, 2:30 p.m. Washington, D.C. President Franklin Roosevelt sat in his study when Navy Secretary Frank Knox called. The words were simple and devastating. Air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is no drill. Roosevelt's face hardened. He asked for details. Knox had few. Communications from Hawaii were fragmentary. Ships sinking. Heavy casualties. The attack was still ongoing. Roosevelt immediately summoned his cabinet and military chiefs. Within an hour, the White House became a command center. Aides rushed through corridors. Telephones rang constantly. Maps appeared on walls. The shock was total. America had expected war eventually. But not this. Not a Sunday morning surprise attack while diplomats still negotiated in Washington. The diplomatic betrayal particularly enraged Roosevelt. Ambassador Nomura and Envoy Kurusu had met with Secretary Hull at 2:05 p.m. Washington time, delivering Japan's message breaking diplomatic relations. But the attack had begun at 7:48 a.m. Hawaii time, which was 1:18 p.m. in Washington, nearly an hour before the diplomats arrived. Hull knew about the attack when the Japanese envoys entered his office. He listened to their message, then responded with controlled fury. In all his years of public service, he had never seen such deceit. The diplomats seemed genuinely shocked. They had not known the attack timing. Tokyo's instructions had been deliberately vague. But ignorance was no excuse. Japan had attacked during active negotiations. The appearance of treachery was absolute. Roosevelt worked through the afternoon drafting a speech for Congress. He consulted advisors on language. The first version called December 7, a date which will live in world history. Roosevelt personally changed it. A date which will live in infamy. Stronger, more emotional. He wanted Americans angry, not merely informed. The speech would be short. 6 minutes. Every word counted. He described the attack, listed other Japanese strikes across the Pacific. The Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Malaya. Japan had launched a coordinated offensive. This was not a limited raid. It was total war. December 8, 1941, 12:30 p.m., United States Capitol. Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress. Galleries were packed. Senators and representatives stood as he entered. The president, crippled by polio, wore leg braces hidden beneath his suit. He gripped the podium and began speaking. His voice carried through radio to millions of Americans. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The words were measured. Roosevelt did not shout. He stated facts with cold precision. The emotional power came from restraint. From describing horror calmly, he detailed the Japanese deception. The attack came while Japanese diplomats maintained the appearance of peace negotiations. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. Not conditional victory, not negotiated settlement, absolute victory. Roosevelt was declaring total war. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. The vote was nearly unanimous. The Senate 82-0. The House 388-1. Only Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana voted no. She had also voted against entering World War I. She was a committed pacifist. Her vote cost her political career. But within 33 minutes of Roosevelt's speech, America was officially at war. The transition from peace to war had taken less than a day. The shock of Pearl Harbor had unified the nation in a way nothing else could have. December 11, 1941. Berlin, Germany. Adolf Hitler made Japan's miscalculation complete. Germany was not obligated to join Japan's war with America. The Tripartite Pact required mutual defense only if a member was attacked. Japan had attacked first. Germany could have stayed neutral. Hitler chose war. He declared war on the United States, bringing America fully into the European conflict. Mussolini's Italy followed. The reason was partly ideological. Hitler despised Roosevelt and American democracy, but mostly it was strategic arrogance. Hitler believed Germany would defeat the Soviet Union before American power could be mobilized. U-boats would starve Britain. America would be irrelevant. The decision was catastrophic. It guaranteed that America's industrial might would be directed against Germany as well as Japan. For Japan, Hitler's decision seemed initially positive. It meant America must fight on two fronts, dividing resources. But the reality was worse. America's entry into the European war guaranteed British survival. It meant unlimited American aid to China. It ensured the Soviet Union would receive American supplies. Japan had hoped to face America alone, gambling that a democracy would negotiate rather than sustain heavy casualties. Instead, Japan now faced America backed by Britain, China, and the Soviet Union. The bet had failed before the first battle was fought. December 1941. Across America. The nation transformed overnight. Recruiting stations were mobbed. Young men lined up for blocks to enlist. The Navy needed 5,000 recruits weekly. It received 30,000. The Army expanded from 1.6 million to over 8 million in 18 months. Factories retooled for war production. Automobile plants stopped making cars and started building tanks. Shipyards launched new vessels on assembly line schedules. The industrial power Japan had feared awakened with terrifying speed. The anger was volcanic. Americans had wanted to avoid war. Pearl Harbor made avoidance impossible. The attack seemed not just an act of war, but a moral crime. Attacking without declaration. Killing on a Sunday morning. Striking while diplomats negotiated. Every detail inflamed American fury. Propaganda posters appeared within days. Remember Pearl Harbor. Avenge December 7th. The slogans were unnecessary. Americans needed no encouragement. The nation united with an intensity never seen before or since. Japanese Americans faced the backlash. Suspicion fell on entire communities. FBI agents arrested community leaders within hours of the attack. Business owners, language teachers, Buddhist priests, anyone with connections to Japan. Eventually, Executive Order 906X forced over 100,000 people into internment camps. Most were American citizens. Many had sons fighting in the U.S. military. The injustice was profound, but wartime fear overrode constitutional principles. The camps would remain open until 1945. Families lost homes, businesses, and savings. The cost of Pearl Harbor included the destruction of civil liberties at home. December 1941. Tokyo, Japan. Japanese leaders celebrated initial success. Newspapers proclaimed great victory. 8 battleships destroyed. American Pacific Fleet crippled. The empire secure. But Admiral Yamamoto did not celebrate. He knew what others refused to see. The attack had succeeded tactically but failed strategically. The carriers had escaped. The fuel storage tanks survived. Pearl Harbor's repair facilities remained functional. Most critically, America was now totally committed to war. The hope of negotiated settlement was gone. Japan had achieved surprise. But surprise only mattered if it led to victory. Yamamoto predicted accurately, "We can run wild for 6 months. After that, I have no expectation of success." The strategic failure was even deeper than Yamamoto knew. Japan had planned to seize the Dutch East Indies, secure oil, and then defend a perimeter. The plan assumed Germany would win in Europe, leaving America isolated. It assumed American morale would crack after early defeats. It assumed Japan could inflict casualties faster than America could replace them. Every assumption was wrong. Germany would not win. American morale would harden, not break. And American production would bury Japan in materiel. The numbers told the story. In 1941, America produced 2,600 aircraft. Japan produced 5,000. America seemed behind. But American production in 1942 would be 47,000 aircraft. In 1943, 86,000. In 1944, 96,000. Japan's production would peak at 28,000 in 1944, then collapse as raw materials ran out. The same pattern held for ships. America would build more carriers in 1943 alone than Japan built during the entire war. Essex-class fleet carriers rolled out of shipyards every few months. Japan could not replace Shokaku when she was eventually sunk. America built her replacements before she was lost. Pearl Harbor revealed Japan's fatal miscalculation. The attack was meant to buy time. Instead, it guaranteed absolute American commitment to total victory. It was meant to shock America into negotiation. Instead, it unleashed industrial fury that Japan could not survive. The truth about Pearl Harbor was that it was simultaneously Japan's greatest tactical success and worst strategic blunder. The attack worked perfectly. The plan behind the attack was based on complete misunderstanding of the enemy. Japan won the battle on December 7th. But in winning that battle, they ensured they would lose the war. The carriers steamed back to Japan, carrying victorious pilots who did not yet understand they had signed their nation's death warrant. The awakening would come slowly, painfully, over 4 years of defeats. But it began the moment the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. Japan had started a war it could not win, against an enemy that would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender. The turning point was not the attack itself. It was the moment America decided that Japan must be destroyed completely. That moment came on December 7, 1941. And nothing Japan did afterward could change it. December 8–10, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Oahu. Dawn revealed the full scale of destruction. Smoke still rose from Arizona's submerged hulk. Oil continued leaking, spreading rainbow sheens across water mixed with debris and bodies. Rescue crews worked through the night and into the next days. They cut through Oklahoma's overturned hull with acetylene torches, listening for tapping from trapped sailors. Some were saved. 32 men were pulled alive from Oklahoma's compartments over 3 days. But hundreds more remained unreachable. The tapping grew weaker, then stopped. Oklahoma became a coffin for 429 men. The casualty count climbed as reports solidified. 2,403 Americans killed. The Navy lost 2,008. The Army 218, Marines 109, civilians 68. Among the dead were men from every state, farm boys and city workers, career sailors and recent recruits. The youngest was 17. Musician Calvin Graham had lied about his age to enlist. The oldest was 64. Chief water tender Robert Scott, serving his final months before retirement. Arizona alone accounted for nearly half the total. 177 men entombed in her hull. Their bodies remain there still, never recovered. The The ship is their monument. Wounded totaled 1,178. Burns were the most common injury. Men had jumped into burning oil. Others were caught in explosions. Hospital staff worked without rest. Tripler Army Medical Center overflowed. Civilian hospitals took the overflow. Blood supplies ran low. Civilians lined up to donate. The territory rallied despite shock. Hawaiian residents, regardless of ethnicity, contributed everything they could. Blood, bandages, food for rescue workers, housing for displaced sailors. The attack had targeted the military, but the entire island felt its impact. Ship losses were staggering but unevenly distributed. Of the 8 battleships struck, 4 were total losses. Arizona would never sail again. Oklahoma was salvaged years later but never recommissioned. Nevada was repaired and returned to service. California, West Virginia, Maryland, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania all eventually rejoined the fleet. The remarkable thing was that most could be salvaged. Pearl Harbor's repair facilities had survived untouched. Dry docks remained functional. Machine shops operated. Skilled workers were available. The shallow harbor meant sunken ships rested in accessible water. Had Fuchida's recommended third wave struck the fuel tanks and repair facilities, the Pacific Fleet would have been crippled for years. Instead, recovery began within weeks. Aircraft losses were nearly total in some categories. Of the Army's 231 aircraft on Oahu, 164 were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The Navy lost 159 aircraft. Most died on the ground, burning before they could take off. Only a handful of American planes got airborne during the attack. Second Lieutenants George Welch and Kenneth Taylor managed to reach their P-40 fighters at Halaiwa Field. They shot down 7 Japanese aircraft between them. But they were exceptions. American air defense essentially did not exist. Japanese losses were minimal. 29 aircraft, 55 aircrewmen. The exchange ratio was devastating. The strategic balance had shifted dramatically. Japan now controlled the Pacific. The American battle line was crippled. Only the carriers remained as credible threats, and they were outnumbered. Japanese forces moved south rapidly. Within days of Pearl Harbor, Japanese troops landed in the Philippines. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day. Wake Island's tiny garrison held for 2 weeks before being overwhelmed. Guam fell in one day. The Dutch East Indies were invaded in January. Singapore, Britain's fortress in Asia, fell in February with 80,000 troops surrendering. Burma fell in May. Japan's defensive perimeter expanded exactly as planned. By mid-1942, the empire controlled territory from Burma to the Gilbert Islands. Resources flowed to Japan: oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina. The economic strangulation that had forced Japan to war was broken. But beneath the surface, the seeds of defeat were already growing. America's industrial response was overwhelming. Roosevelt asked Congress for 60,000 aircraft in 1942. Experts said impossible. Industry delivered 47,136. He asked for 45,000 tanks. They built 49,000. He asked for 20,000 anti-aircraft guns. They produced 43,000. Shipyards that had launched 1 vessel per year now launched 1 per month. Henry Kaiser's yards pioneered mass production techniques. Liberty ships were built in sections, then welded together. Time from keel laying to launch dropped from a year to months, then to weeks. The record was 4 days, 15 hours. Japan could not match this pace. Japanese shipyards were still using traditional construction methods, skilled craftsmen building ships one at a time. American mobilization extended beyond factories. The entire economy retooled for war. Rationing began. Sugar, coffee, gasoline, rubber, meat, butter. Americans accepted shortages willingly. Victory gardens appeared in backyards. Citizens grew their own vegetables to free commercial food for troops. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Rosie the Riveter became the symbol of female war workers. By 1943, women comprised over a third of the civilian workforce. They built aircraft, welded ships, manufactured ammunition. The social changes would outlast the war. Military training accelerated. Boot camps expanded across the country. Raw recruits became soldiers in weeks instead of months. Quality suffered initially, but quantity mattered more. America could afford losses that Japan could not. Every lost American pilot could be replaced by 3 new ones. Every sunk ship could be replaced by 5 new hulls. Japan's losses were irreplaceable. The Empire's industrial base could not keep pace with attrition. Pearl Harbor had destroyed 8 battleships, but America would build 10 new battleships during the war. Japan would build 2. Both started before Pearl Harbor. The strategic situation was already shifting by January 1942. Japan held territory. America held potential. Territory could be lost. Potential, once mobilized, became unstoppable force. Admiral Yamamoto understood this. His staff celebrated conquests across the Pacific. Yamamoto warned them, "We have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve." The quote is likely apocryphal, but the sentiment was accurate. Japan had won everything it could win in the first 6 months. Now came the reckoning. The immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor showed tactical devastation, but the long-term aftermath would show that Japan had traded short-term success for inevitable destruction. The giant was awake, and it would not stop until Japan was crushed completely. The Long Shadow, June 4–7, 1942. Midway Atoll, Central Pacific. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the reckoning came at Midway. Admiral Yamamoto planned another decisive blow. Seize Midway Island. Draw out the American carriers. Destroy them in battle. Force Roosevelt to negotiate. The plan followed the same logic as Pearl Harbor. One dramatic victory would break American will. But American cryptanalysts had broken Japanese naval codes. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew the attack was coming. He positioned 3 carriers northeast of Midway: Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown. Japanese carriers approached from the northwest, 4 of the 6 that struck Pearl Harbor: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. The 2 forces collided on June 4th. The battle turned on timing and luck. Japanese aircraft attacked Midway Island first, bombing the airfield. American torpedo bombers counterattacked and were slaughtered. 41 torpedo planes launched. 35 were shot down. Not a single torpedo hit. The sacrifice was not in vain. The attack drew Japanese fighters down to sea level. They were busy destroying torpedo bombers when American dive bombers arrived at 10,000 feet. No fighters rose to intercept. 3 squadrons dove on Japanese carriers caught rearming aircraft. In 5 minutes, 3 carriers died. Akagi took 1 bomb through her deck. It detonated among aircraft being fueled and armed. Secondary explosions tore through the ship. She burned for hours before being scuttled. Kaga took 4 bombs. Fires spread immediately. She sank that evening. Soryu took 3 bombs and exploded. She went down within 20 minutes. Hiryu escaped initially, launching a counterstrike that crippled Yorktown. But American dive bombers found Hiryu that afternoon. 4 bombs struck her deck. She burned through the night. Japanese destroyers torpedoed her hull the next morning. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, all the pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor. The Empire's carrier force was gutted. America lost 1 carrier, Yorktown. More importantly, America could replace losses. Japan could not. The strategic balance shifted permanently at Midway. Japan would never again hold naval superiority. The 6 months Yamamoto predicted had ended. Everything afterward would be retreat. August 1942. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. America went on offense. Marines landed on Guadalcanal, seizing a partially built Japanese airfield. The island was strategically minor, but symbolically crucial. America's first amphibious assault. The battle lasted 6 months. Both sides poured reinforcements into tropical jungle. Naval battles raged offshore. Ships sank in such numbers that the waters became known as Iron Bottom Sound. Eventually, Japanese forces withdrew. They had lost 31,000 troops. America lost 7,000. But America was advancing. Japan was retreating. The pattern would continue for 3 years. The war became attritional. Island after island. Each assault costly. Each Japanese garrison fighting to annihilation. Tarawa in November 1943 cost 3,400 American casualties in 76 hours. But the island fell. Saipan in June 1944 cost 16,000 American casualties. But 30,000 Japanese died, including civilians who jumped from cliffs rather than surrender. Iwo Jima in February 1945 cost 26,000 American casualties. Nearly 20,000 Japanese defenders died. Only 216 were captured. The Japanese military taught death before dishonor. Soldiers believed it. The result was slaughter. Strategic bombing accelerated Japan's collapse. B-29 superfortresses began raiding in 1944. Initial attacks targeted factories and military facilities. Results were limited. Japan's industry was dispersed. Cloud cover obscured targets. Then General Curtis LeMay changed tactics. Instead of precision strikes on military targets, he ordered area bombing of cities. Incendiary bombs, not to destroy factories but to burn residential areas. Workers with no homes could not work. The firebombing campaign was deliberately designed to kill civilians. Tokyo burned on the night of March 9, 1945. 334 B-29s dropped 1,165 tons of incendiaries. Fires merged into a conflagration. Winds reached 100 miles per hour. Temperatures exceeded 1,800 degrees. People boiled in canals where they sought refuge. Over 100,000 civilians died in one night, more than either atomic bomb would kill. The attack was the single deadliest air raid in history. It was also just the beginning. LeMay burned every major Japanese city methodically. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama. By July 1945, Japan's urban areas were ash. Millions were homeless. Industrial production had collapsed, but the government refused surrender. Japan's military situation was hopeless by mid-1945. The Navy was destroyed. Most ships were sunk or without fuel. The Air Force had been reduced to kamikaze attacks. Pilots with minimal training flew one-way missions. The tactic was born of desperation. Japan could not replace skilled pilots lost in combat. Better to use untrained pilots as guided missiles. Over 3,000 kamikaze pilots died. They sank dozens of ships, but they could not stop the advance. The home islands were blockaded. Food shortages caused widespread malnutrition. Military planners prepared for invasion, predicting millions of casualties on both sides. August 6, 1945, Hiroshima. The Enola Gay, a B-29, dropped a single bomb. Little boy. An atomic weapon using uranium-235. The bomb detonated at 1,900 feet altitude. The fireball vaporized everything within half a mile. Thermal radiation burned exposed skin 3 miles away. The blast wave destroyed buildings across the city. 80,000 people died instantly. Tens of thousands more died over weeks from radiation sickness. The city ceased to exist. Japan's military council met. Some urged surrender. Others wanted to continue fighting. The decision was not unanimous. August 9, 1945. Nagasaki. A second atomic bomb fell. Fat Man. A plutonium implosion device. 40,000 died immediately. The Soviet Union invaded Manchuria the same day. Over 1 million Soviet troops smashed through Japanese defenses. Manchukuo, the puppet state Japan had created 14 years earlier, collapsed in days. Japan now faced enemies on all sides. Atomic weapons from the air. Soviet armies from the north. American invasion from the south. The situation was apocalyptic. Emperor Hirohito intervened personally. For the first time in the war, he exercised direct authority. He told his council that continuation was impossible. The military wanted to fight on. They proposed one final decisive battle on Japanese soil. Millions would die, but honor would be satisfied. Hirohito overruled them. He recorded a surrender message. His voice, never before broadcast publicly, announced Japan's capitulation. The war must end, he said. To continue would mean the extinction of the Japanese people. August 15, 1945, Tokyo. Japanese citizens heard their emperor's voice for the first time. The broadcast was formal, using archaic language. Many listeners did not immediately understand. Then the reality penetrated. Japan had surrendered. Unconditionally. Everything the military had promised, victory, honor, the preservation of the empire, had been lies. The nation had been destroyed for nothing. Some officers committed suicide rather than accept defeat. But most simply stopped fighting. The war was over. The cost was almost incomprehensible. Japan lost between 2.6 and 3.1 million people. About half were military, half civilian. Every major city except Kyoto had been burned. Industrial capacity was 5% of pre-war levels. The merchant fleet was destroyed. The navy sank. The army disbanded. The empire that had stretched from Manchuria to New Guinea was gone. Korea was liberated. Taiwan returned to China. The Pacific Islands became American trust territories. Japan itself was occupied by American forces. The occupation would last 7 years. The strategic consequences of Pearl Harbor had fully materialized. Japan's attempt to secure resources by force had resulted in total destruction. The empire lost everything it tried to protect. The attack that was supposed to buy time for negotiated settlement had instead guaranteed absolute defeat. Yamamoto's prediction was vindicated. Japan ran wild for 6 months. Then America's industrial power crushed them. The war Japan started on December 7, 1941, ended on August 15, 1945. In between, Japan had proven that determination and courage could not overcome material disparity, that tactical brilliance could not compensate for strategic miscalculation, that attacking America while believing America was weak was the worst mistake Japan could possibly make. Pearl Harbor was not the beginning of Japan's rise. It was the beginning of Japan's destruction. The attack succeeded completely. The strategy behind it failed totally. And the price was paid in millions of lives and the annihilation of everything Japan fought to preserve. What Pearl Harbor really meant. The truth about Pearl Harbor is not found in the explosions or the sinking ships. It is found in the decisions made months and years before the first bomb fell. Japan did not attack America because of irrational aggression or inherent militarism. Japan attacked because its leaders believed they had no choice. Strangled by embargo, facing economic collapse, convinced that retreat meant national humiliation worse than death, they gambled on war. The gamble was based on fatal miscalculations about American character, industrial capacity, and willingness to fight. But it was not madness. It was desperation dressed in strategic planning. The real tragedy of Pearl Harbor was its preventability. Not in the military sense. Once Japan decided for war, the attack was inevitable. But in the broader sense of choices made over years. America's economic pressure was intended to force Japanese compliance without war. It achieved the opposite. Japan's expansion into China was meant to secure resources and prestige. It provoked the embargo that threatened national survival. Both sides acted rationally within their own frameworks. Both misunderstood the other completely. The failure was not of intelligence or military preparedness. It was a failure of imagination. Neither side could conceive how the other thought. Pearl Harbor revealed something profound about human conflict. Wars often begin not because one side wants them, but because both sides believe the alternative is worse. Japan's leaders did not want war with America. They understood the odds were against them. But they chose war over what they saw as slow national death. America did not want war in the Pacific. Roosevelt focused on Europe, but he could not accept Japanese conquest of Asia. Both nations backed themselves into positions where compromise became impossible. The attack was the moment when accumulated decisions reached their logical conclusion. The lessons remain relevant. Resource scarcity drives conflict when nations believe access is existential. Economic warfare can force desperate choices. Diplomatic breakdown occurs when neither side understands the other's red lines. Military planning cannot overcome strategic impossibility. And attacking a vastly stronger power in hope that shock will bring negotiation is almost always catastrophic miscalculation. Japan learned these lessons at enormous cost. The world should remember them. Pearl Harbor changed everything and nothing. It brought America into global war, accelerating the defeat of fascism. It demonstrated that industrial capacity ultimately determines modern war outcomes more than courage or tactics. It showed that surprise attack without the strength to sustain war merely ensures eventual destruction. But it did not change human nature. Nations still miscalculate. Leaders still choose war over perceived humiliation. Economic pressure still breeds desperation. The specific circumstances of 1941 will not repeat. But the dynamics that led to Pearl Harbor, miscommunication, desperation, cultural incomprehension, strategic gambling, continue in different forms. The men who died at Pearl Harbor, on both sides, were victims of decisions made by leaders who convinced themselves they had no choice. The sailors on Arizona, the pilots who flew from Japanese carriers, the Chinese civilians suffering under occupation that the attack was meant to sustain. All were caught in a machine of national choices that swept away individual lives without notice. Their deaths were not meaningless, but they were avoidable. That is the truth no one told. Pearl Harbor was not inevitable fate or historical necessity. It was the result of specific choices, made by specific people who believed incorrectly that war was preferable to alternatives. History remembers December 7, 1941, as a day of infamy, a surprise attack, a tactical triumph, a strategic blunder. All true, but the deeper truth is simpler and sadder. Pearl Harbor was the day two nations that both wanted to avoid war finally collided because neither could imagine backing down. The explosions and fire were merely the visible manifestation of failures long in the making, and the cost would be measured not in ships, but in years of suffering that followed from one Sunday morning when bombs fell, and the world changed forever. The attack on Pearl Harbor wasn't just a moment of military surprise, it was the culmination of years of desperation, miscalculation, and diplomatic failure. A nation trapped by geography, strangled by embargo, gambling everything on one devastating blow. But Pearl Harbor was only the beginning. If you want to understand how tactical brilliance led to strategic disaster, how Japan's 6 months of victories turned into 4 years of annihilation, how one Sunday morning changed the course of human history, then make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the stories that textbooks don't tell you. In the comments below, tell me, do you think Pearl Harbor could have been prevented? Was Japan's attack an act of desperation or aggression? I read every comment, and your perspective matters. And if you want to see what happened next, how America turned the tide just 6 months later at Midway, click the video on your screen right now. The full story of Japan's rise and fall is one worth understanding. This is history not as propaganda, but as truth. Real events, real people, real consequences. Thanks for watching. And remember, the past is never really past. It echoes in every decision we make today. See you in the next one.